I appreciate everyone coming out today. This morning that I want to share with you before Marge introduces our visitor. I want to thank Mary Ellen Roshak, and I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
Good. The bread that you're getting, Mary Ellen is baking this, and I just found out she bakes all week, every time a week, and giving this bread away. We really appreciate it. I saved mine and had it last night. Unfortunately, my grandsons came over, and all four of them were knocking it out fast like a slice it. So it's good. We appreciate airline people that are contributing, and I want to really thank Dorothy and Jana for manning the camera and doing such a good job of that. Did you set the chairs up too? Wow. I came over dreading it last night about 6:30 and walked in and voila. I called my grandsons to be on standby to see what was going to happen. Yeah, I really appreciate Garth and Jana. I want to also say something about our potluck. It's so hot, I've decided to push it back a little bit. We're still in the 90s next week. I'm going to be gone next week. I'm going to take a week off to rest for a little while. And I'll be back next Sunday. For those that are interested, today Jimmy Hoffa was kidnapped and was supposedly murdered in 1975 on this day, just for those that are really interested, teamsters and gangsters. He was pardoned in 1971 by Richard Nixon. Wonder why? You know, he got things for that. But anyway, that's what happened 47 years ago today. And with that, Marge, would you like to introduce our visitors?
Yeah, some of them don't want to be introduced. Okay. This is Ken and Rita Dudecker. They're moving here, right, from Minnesota. And this is the first time that they've been in our class. I didn't warn them or anything. I told them the noise was created because we're friendly and we love each other. So anyway, we're glad that they are here. Now these people back here just wanted to remain anonymous. So
Really point you up.
your first name.
Man, we're just embarrassing everybody. So you're not.
Okay. And I'm Chris. And she comes to this church, but she's avoided our class, I think. Okay, well, we're glad that you're here. And now you invited these people in. You know their name?
Well, I didn't know, but hi. Can we get their name? Sure, I'm Marty. Yeah.
I'm Chris.
Okay, Marty and Chris.
Last names?
Thompson.
I just thought maybe we might be related to you or somebody in here. But there is somebody here that I am related to, and this is our son, John Eggers, and this is his wife, Terry, and they're visiting us. It's wonderful. They have been here in a lot of years. They live on Whidbey Island, from in the Sound, from Seattle, and our son is an OBGYN at Swedish Hospital in downtown Seattle. We're just so happy to have so many wonderful people.
Come on and sit right here, or you can sit here.
Okay, hi. Thank you. Anyway, that's it.
Well, thank you.
I think, well, these people are like visitors. Isn't this fabulous?
Yes, I'm so glad to have them back.
You know why we have them? It's the 5th Sabbath and they don't have to take care of the offering on the 5th Sabbath.
Yeah, they're real troopers.
Yes, we're glad you're here.
This is a discussion class. Word of the life of Jesus. If you have a comment, please raise your hand. We want to hear from you. Please make your comment brief. Try to hold it for 30 seconds if you can, please. We have probably 80 people here today, and I want to thank our folks on Zoom for coming. And I want to say good morning to you. Our teacher this morning is Doug Tilstra. Doug helped me, and I'll get through this very quickly. Doug helped me start this class roughly I started it 12 years ago, and it was going that fast. Doug joined me. He was teaching here in Southern, and after he jumped in, this place skyrocketed. We had to go to different Sabbath school room after different Sabbath school room to keep our people seated. This is a discussion class. We are in the life of Jesus. This class was designed, created for ex-Adventists. It was designed and created for those who think they want to leave this church, who are about to leave this church, but really don't know where they're going. And they basically might have almost ready to be throwing in the towel. We welcome those folks. If there are any of you fit that, and if you know anyone that fits that category, bring them. We want them. I was an ex-Adventist for over 25 years. I hated this church. I hated it.
Why?
We'll get into that some other time. With the grace of God, we have people that have this church. I stand here today.
Amen.
We have our issues, we have our problems, as all churches do. I think sometimes we just have a few more in some churches, but we work through it. This is the life of Jesus that we're studying about. And since the room seems to be full, we have gotten into the habit, thankfully, of introducing certain members of our class to you so that you'll know who we are, begin to know who we are, and know more about each other so that we can connect. I'm looking forward to our first potluck, probably in 2 or 3 weeks. And by the way, the reason we don't have one sooner, this place is booked all through August. Our kitchen, our facility here. That's how popular this church is getting or has gotten. Today we want Gordon and maybe Cheryl, I don't know, to come up. No, Cheryl's not coming. I get that. And Gordon, come up and tell us a little history on yourself. Gordon has this wonderful talent that he can be very, very expressive. So we're going to gong you if you go over 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. Okay? Come on up.
He just wants to get me out of the way. So he can do the other. Don't talk quite as. Watch out for Stacy.
Yeah, she doesn't talk at all.
All right, here I go. 1942, I was born. 47, I lived in Berlin for a year after the war. Had to leave because of the Berlin airlift. These are things that have influenced who I am. Went to a lot of schools, lived in Japan, 1955 for 3 years. Out in the country and then in Tokyo. I graduated from Lincoln High School. I started wrestling. Went to University of Nebraska, electrical engineering and nuclear engineering. I wrestled there. Then I was commissioned in 1965 as a naval officer and went to submarines. Made 4 patrols on the Polaris submarine, went to new construction. And during this time, I became an Adventist. But I was kind of works oriented, kind of, very typical for a lot of it. I was really into end time events, and I wasn't focusing where I should be, which is on the Lord. While I was in the Navy, I told them I couldn't work on Sabbath anymore, and so they threw me off the submarine and maybe teach for a year. Then I'm out. And I worked at the Regulatory Commission on licensing advanced reactors. 3 Mile Island happened, and I was part of the recovery team on that and the analysis of it. Am I going too slow?
You're doing great.
All right. Then I went and I was a staff member of the House of Representatives, a nuclear guy in the House. I then moved over to the Department of Energy, and I had several advanced reactor programs that I was working on. In 1985, I left under interesting circumstances. which some of you heard. Started doing consulting. 1989, Chernobyl happened, and I got involved as a consultant in the study of Soviet-designed reactors, which took a while. Went to Finland, looked at one of their reactors. They wouldn't let us. Russia. And then after that, Perestroika, Soviet Union came apart. And so then we started going over there. And I was part of the Western Soviet reactor safety initiative that started by all Western countries. And that was really interesting. I've had some great jobs. And someday anybody wants to ask me any questions, I'll be happy with most questions. I consulted to, including the Chernobyl thing until about 2005. Then I retired. You know, I want to thank, there's a lot of people in here who have helped me become a more better guy. And I can see almost everybody here that I know, even you, man. And I want to thank you for that. My filters, much better than they used to be. I don't put in my mouth quite as much. You hadn't noticed? No, yes. That's enough for one. Thank you very much.
I want to hurry up and introduce Doug because we got a great lesson coming. Doug is left Southern to take a job of, we used to call it Dean of Students, which was a tough job here at Southern Missionary College 50-something years ago. He's now Dean of Student Affairs at Walla Walla. We zoom him in at least once a month, maybe twice a month. Doug is a master teacher, and we're privileged to have him here. So with that said, let's have a word of prayer and we'll kick it off. Father, thank you for this great group of people. Thank you for Gordon and his story. Thank you for Carol. So glad they're here this morning. And thank you for all of our visitors. We're grateful. We're honored. We're humbled by how good you've been. What a great job you have done guiding us, trying to help these folks as with what little we have to offer. We hope that you'll be with Doug this morning. Help him bring your word to us. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Good to be with you. And Ken, thank you for taking class at a moment's notice last week when I was having some technical difficulties, but it's really good to be with you now. And Garth, I again wanted to say thank you for jumping in and taking the technical side on that end. I still am amazed that going on 6 years now, this has worked week after week. And we started pre-COVID with all of our experimenting with doing class remotely like this. And of course, once COVID hit, everybody was doing it, but we had been ahead of that curve for a couple of years. So had a little bit of jump on them and have learned how to perfect it. And then now we make them available online and you get a link every week, thanks to the work that Abner and Ken do. So it's just, I just count it a real privilege to be able to be with you remotely, even after we have moved away. And Gordon, thank you for your story. I had heard bits and pieces of that. And I guess the part I probably knew as a highlight is the 3 Mile Island, but I had no idea that years after that you were working with Chernobyl and so forth. I read a book recently on that topic of the Chernobyl meltdown, and it was fascinating. I didn't see your name in it, but they probably just made that a mission. So, anyway, thank you for telling us a little bit more about yourself. Well, today we are in Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, verses 1 through 12. And we are going through the life of Christ, and a tool that we're using to go through the life of Christ is called Harmony of the Gospels. And I think we have copies of those. Marge, do we have some extra copies if people need them?
I've given them all out. I'm sorry.
Okay. So we don't have any extra copies. However, if
I guess there's some more.
there's some more up there. Okay. If you don't have a harmony today, you'll be just fine, because this passage is only found in Luke. And what the harmony does is it puts Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side on the page when it's telling the same story. But this is our gift to you. We'd love for you to have it. Even if you're just visiting from out of town, please feel free to take the book with you. It's a great tool. And it's the scriptures side by side with Matthew, Mark, and Luke on the page together. But you'll notice that we've been in the Luke, go back. Let's see here. Since page 119, and we'll be here for a little bit longer. These are stories that only Luke tells, so it's unique to Luke. And if you have the harmony, it's on page 123, in a regular Bible. It's Luke chapter 12. And this is a story about hypocrisy. And the funny thing that I've noticed about hypocrisy is that we love to talk about the hypocrisy of others. There's something a little bit hypocritical about that. I don't know if you've noticed the same thing, but it seems as though when there's a topic of hypocrisy, and we're talking about hypocrisy, we love to talk about how other people are hypocrites. And I rarely hear the conversation going the direction of saying, here's where I struggle with hypocrisy. Instead, it seems like we are fascinated by talking about all the other hypocrites we know. Just an observation. And so could I make a suggestion today that as we read this story and talk about hypocrisy today, we limit ourselves to examples that come from our own lives, instead of thinking of examples that come from other people's lives. Just let's give it a try and see how it works. And while it's true that there's a time and a place to consider the hypocrisy of others, and certainly that's what Jesus is doing here, I would say that probably if anybody on this planet was in a position to talk about other people's hypocrisy, it was Jesus, because he was completely free of any hypocrisy. And he could say some things and say some pretty strong things about hypocrisy, and he was absolutely, completely free of it. Kind of like the story that we studied some time back, where Jesus says, let the one who is without sin throw the first stone. And you realize that in that circle, who was the only person qualified to throw the first stone?
Jesus.
Jesus was, and he chose not to. And so in our discussion of hypocrisy, it might be well for us to think, is there anything here that applies to me? And maybe not. Let's not try to make an application if there is none. But let's at least be open to that idea. And instead of making this a time to point out all the hypocrites that we know and what all they're doing wrong, let's say, Lord, is there anything that you have in this story for me? And if not, great. But if so, let's take it to heart. So with that, let's jump into the story, and we'll start with Luke chapter 12 and verse 1. Now on page 123 of your harmony, this just flows straight down from chapter 11. There's no break, and that's intentional because it is a continuation of that same story. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, but for right now, let's just read the story itself. So we're in Luke chapter 12, starting with verse 1. It's way down at the bottom of page 123. Meanwhile, and that word meanwhile, of course, gives us some context that what happened before makes sense in this story. It's the context that we probably ought to remind ourselves of. So we'll come back to that. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear, in the inner rooms, will be proclaimed from the roofs. I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that can do no more. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after killing of the body, has power to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. I tell you the truth. Whoever acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge him before the angels of God. But he who disowns me before men will be disowned before the angels of God. And whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven. But anyone who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. When you are brought before synagogues, rulers, and authorities, do not worry about how you will defend yourselves or what you will say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you at that time what you should say. You know, at first glance, and I'll have to admit, even after some study of this, this almost seems to be a collection of disjointed proverbs. It almost seems to be like reading down a list of Poor Richard's Almanac by Benjamin Franklin or something like that, where you have all these interesting little statements that just happen to be on the same page. They are not connected to one another. And I'll have to admit that even after some spending time on this and study, that I'll quickly admit, I don't know that I see all the connection. I think I see some of it, and I'd like to learn from you today how we can see more of that connection. But clearly there is some larger connection here around the subject of hypocrisy. And I'd like us to look at the context to see if we can make more sense of that. And if we can understand what Jesus is saying here about hypocrisy and what difference that makes in our lives. So let me first ask some application questions to get us in the mindset of willingness to listen to this speaking to ourselves. You don't need to answer this out loud, but I would like you to answer it in your head. And then if you're comfortable, speak up out loud. Instead of the word hypocrisy, let's use the word phony. Now, they're not identical, but they're close enough that might help some. Think of the word phony. And then as an opposite, think of the word authentic. And think about in your own experience when you have been phony or when you have been authentic. And maybe sometimes back to back. Our lives sometimes are that complicated that we can act exactly opposite within 5 minutes of each other. And we can be really authentic and then turn into another situation and be really phony, or the other way around, be really phony and then turn to be really authentic. So I'd like you to just pause for a moment. I'm going to give you a moment to think. Can you think of any time in your own life when you had an experience of being authentic, or you had an experience of being phony, or maybe both back to back? I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm seeing two hands back there. So I see two people willing to give an example, please. I didn't see who was first. Let's start. Okay, the camera is panning over here. And I think it's Duane. Hi, Duane.
I think you're asking a hard question for us to really be vulnerable around. This.
Yeah.
But I think someplace that I sometimes have to confront my own self. I'll be sitting with a client and talking about an issue and inviting them into some challenging space. And am just so aware that I'm not that person that I'm inviting them to be. So so I'm presenting something that I yet have not grown into that space. And I think fear often prevents us from being truly authentic.
Yep. Duane, thank you for leading off with your own vulnerability. And I have a story or two that I'm going to share in a moment. Thank you. I appreciate that. And John, we'll come back to you, but I think there was a hand on the other side of the room, and then we'll come back to John.
Right here. Go ahead.
Hi.
I was introduced to this class. It's a perfect example to make this presentation. I was born and raised Seventh Adventist, went to Seventh Adventist grade school, high school, academy, college, graduate school, all through the Adventist system. All through those years, I was a phony Christian. Since then, I've been going to the Baptist church, and now I'm in a non-denominational church. I have learned that my Christianity means a genuine relationship with Jesus Christ, the Lord, through my study of him, my approach of him, and his coming to me through the word. And I feel now that I'm a genuine Christian because I have a love for God that I never had before through the fake religiosity, adhering to tradition, adhering to works. I'm not worried about works. I'm not going to be condemned for what day of the week I go to the church. I'm going to be condemned for what is or is not in my heart.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, Marge, were you repeating her name and I missed that?
Last name Wittenberg. Kim Wittenberg.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for speaking up. Back to John. John, you had a comment.
I believe that hypocrisy will always include lying. And it gets to me in a hurry when I tell a lie. It seems like that's so close to the devil that I want to get away from it in a hurry. Being phony and hypocritical, I think it's tied in with lying all the time.
Thank you. We have a couple more hands here. Let's go over here, please.
I think as a pastor's wife, it's very difficult not to be phony. When people come up to you and they have conspiracy theories they want you to listen to about chemtrails, and they're going to kill everybody. And you've got to act like you want to hear and that you are interested in them personally. And they can make a long story out of a short one.
Yes, I can relate to that, both as a pastor. I worked 20 years as a pastor, and like you said, as a pastor's wife. Thank you. Thank you. Did I miss any other hands?
Gordon.
Doug, Rob just labeled that, Ruth, diplomacy.
Diplomacy.
Not phony, it's diplomacy.
Yep.
That's a nice way to say it.
Okay, any other hands? Did I miss anybody else? Yes, please, Gordon.
I had never had this thought before. And when I started looking at those words, it struck me.
Speak up, Gordon.
It struck me that most people live a life of some hypocrisy. We get up in the morning, we dress up, so we're going to go out, we look good. We try to present ourselves as best we can. except when we lose it, but that's another issue.
Right, right.
In some way, that's a hypocritical thing.
Okay, I'm going to take two more comments. I see two hands up, and then I'm going to get back into the passage. Please, I don't know who was first, but maybe it was, okay, please.
We have John, Roy, and
Rhonda.
Rhonda.
Oh, three. Okay, so John, and then Roy, and then Rhonda.
One way I look at it is that we try to put the best face we can on things.
Mhm.
And, for instance, with your kids, when they say, did you ever do this or did you ever do that?
Mhm.
And have you ever done these things or whatever? I don't think it's wrong to hold up an ideal, even if we don't reach that ideal.
Mhm.
And instead of bearing our souls with every possible weakness we have,
Yep.
We can still strive for the ideal even when we don't reach it.
Yep.
And I'm not sure that I'm ready to label that hypocrisy.
Thank you, John. And I want to comment real briefly. I think that we'll find ourselves coming back to this, but before we go on to Roy and Rhonda, this may or may not be helpful, but maybe some of you saw the old Jim Carrey movie, Liar, Liar. I was at a hotel traveling not long ago, and that movie came on in the exercise room where I was working out, and I thought, oh, I haven't seen this since my kids were young, and we watched it. Well, no matter what you think of Jim Carrey or the movie Liar, Liar, the thing that struck me is that, as you might remember, the theme of this movie is that the dad was a habitual liar, and he would promise things he would never follow through on. And the son makes a birthday wish. It's kind of a magical movie that his dad would never lie again. And from that point on, Jim Carrey plays this marvelously, as his comic personality allowed him to do, that he could not lie. And he said every single thing that was in his mind, and everybody heard exactly what he was thinking. And somehow that was the exact opposite, for people to hear everything that you're thinking. And I think that is actually a misnomer. And I think that while it made a funny movie, it did not necessarily speak to the opposite. And we could go into this in more depth, but something that we see is that even Jesus, as the ideal, authentic person, did not say everything he was thinking all the time. And I think that we need to be discerning and saying, does being honest mean that everybody hears everything I'm thinking every moment as I think it? And I think that we would say, well, no, that's just not even common sense. So how do we distinguish what is hypocrisy from what is not? And I think the scripture passage will help us on that. So we're going to come back to that, but thank you for pointing that out, John. Let's go to Roy and then Rhonda.
What I'd like to say is how we can use this reality between the two to our benefit, in that when I find myself, because Ellen White tells us that we should die to self daily. And so when I find myself not being authentic, then I recognize that I'm being selfish and not selfless. And therefore I can see the movement between being selfish versus being selfless, and how Christ is giving us the grace to become selfless in his kingdom.
Yeah. And Roy, I'd like to use your comment after Rhonda's to transition back to scripture. I think there's something really worthwhile there. Thank you. Rhonda, you're going to have the last comment here.
Yeah, I'm thinking of going to church through the decades or any social setting, and how are you? Fine, I'm fine. I thought, well, I'm not fine. I just cried all the way to church, but there's only going to be a handful of people that are going to know that. But through Al-Anon, through my education later in life, and being a therapist and support group, I try to be a little more honest about that. And I've realized the older I got that everybody's got their stuff. It's not just me.
Yep. Thank you, Rhonda. Well, let me take Rhonda's comments and Roy's comments to kind of blend together and then get back into our passage. I think that it would be really foolish, going back to my own comment about Jim Carrey's movie, to think that authenticity means everybody hears everything in a stream of consciousness that I'm possibly thinking at every moment, and they have this running commentary on what's going on in my head. That's foolish. And it was, like I said, a good comedy in a movie, but I don't think it's what Jesus is talking about. On the other hand, he is calling for us to be authentic people and for us to speak truth. Paul is going to say this later after the life of Christ in Ephesians 4. He says, learn to grow up and to speak the truth in love. And maybe coming back to this idea of diplomacy and hearing people's conspiracy theories, etc., there might be a time to say, I think of what I said to my mother a year ago during the heat wave. It took me 2 hours every morning and evening to water all of her plants to save them during this heat wave. And she had hundreds and hundreds of plants, which took a long time for us to get rid of after her death. And I was, we found homes for them all. They were all beautiful plants. But during that heat wave and the indoor and outdoor, I said, Mother, I am watering your plants, not because I love your plants, but because I love you.
Amen.
But we've got to find a different solution here because this is not sustainable. I cannot spend 4 hours a day watering your plants when I'm working full time. And I think there's a time to speak truth in love and to experience directness and to speak our needs and so forth, instead of, oh, I love watering your plants. I mean, that would be a lie. And that may not be a great example, but another one I wanted to give you from my own life is something that happened just a couple of weeks ago, is that my daughter, grown daughter, was speaking to me about something that had happened in our family that I was a part of, and it had been very hurtful to her. And as I listened to her, it would have been easy to become defensive. And instead, I chose to become curious and ask more questions and to step into what she was saying and the experience that she'd had. And within 15, 20 minutes of conversation, it became very clear that something that I thought I prided myself on doing well, I was not doing well at all. In fact, I had been a part of the source of her pain within our family. And what's worse is it was something that I did not respect in other people. And when I looked at other people and I would see this quality that she was pointing out I was a part of, I would be critical. And at that moment, I realized my own hypocrisy, because something that I was critical of others and could be quick to condemn others for, she was telling me she was experiencing from me. And that was a moment of honesty and authenticity for me, rather than trying to cover up and say, no, 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 you're mistaken, you've seen this wrong, for me to sit with that and for me to say, I need to think about that. And then we had a couple of conversations over the next couple of days, and I could say, you know, I need to take some ownership of that. Thanks for saying something. I see that here's where we're dealing with more the heart of the matter of authenticity and hypocrisy. The hypocrisy, back like you said, Roy, is oftentimes when we're trying to cover up our own selfishness and not experience something that is hard for us to look at because it doesn't put us in the best possible light. And hypocrisy is oftentimes us trying to put ourselves in a better light so that other people will think better of us, treat us better. And authenticity is willing to sit with that discomfort that says, you know, I'm not always who I think I am. And I'm willing to step into that and to be more true and authentic about that. Now, there's many other ways to define hypocrisy and authenticity, but that's something that happened to me just in the last week or so that has come to my mind as I've read this lesson, and that I think your comments have helped me see more clearly. Let's get back into the passage. Let's look at the passage again, and let's start with verse 1, where he says, meanwhile, Luke is telling a story here, and he says, meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered. Now, this is a great contrast to the story that just came before. Ken taught the lesson a couple weeks ago that covered the story that is before this. And there's a contrast in many ways Notice, go back up to chapter 11, verse 37. It's near the top of the page here in the harmony. It says, when Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. Now, even if the Pharisee was very rich and had a large house, it obviously was not thousands of people. It was a dinner party. And Ken, I love the way you described that when you said, how's this dinner party going? Because Jesus gets into some pretty strong interaction with this group around this dinner party. It's a group of Pharisees. And that sets up the contrast, because here is a small group of Pharisees that Jesus is having dinner with, and he leaves that house, and now he is mobbed by thousands, most of whom are not Pharisees. So we have a contrast in the type of people that Jesus is with, and we have a contrast in the numbers of people. He's with a small group of Pharisees in this story, and then he's with a large group of non-Pharisees in the next story. But the two stories are tied together with what happened in that dinner party with the Pharisees. Are you with me so far? Everybody following? Okay, let's not review the whole story, but let's just look at some of the highlights from the story that Ken taught a couple of weeks ago. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him, so he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee, noticing that Jesus did not first wash before the meal, was surprised. Then the Lord said to him, now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? Now, we're going to stop there, and we'll drop down and see a couple of other highlights. But the theme of hypocrisy starts in the dinner party. And Jesus points out the difference between inside and outside. And he's going to come back to that with his comments that he makes here in the story we're studying for today. The difference between what's inside and what's outside. So let me come back to some of the examples that you mentioned. If, for example, somebody comes up to me in the lobby and just is talking a blue streak, and I could care less about what they're saying, but I'm nodding and smiling. And then as soon as I walk away from them, the comment that I make to my family or the comment I make to a friend is really harsh and critical and demeaning of that person who was just talking to me. There's a difference between what I was showing them with my face and now what I'm saying about them with my mouth. And there's a disconnect. Now, that doesn't mean I need to agree with and like everything they said. And it may even mean that I can take exception and say, I don't agree with the things that they're saying, or I find that very whatever. But if the message I'm giving to them is, I like you, and the message I tell somebody else is, I think they're a stupid idiot, there is a contrast. There's a conflict between what I am saying outwardly and what I'm experiencing inwardly. And Jesus is talking about that difference between what's inside and what's outside. And so the question is, what do you do about that then? What if you really do think they're a stupid idiot? Do you say that to their face? Do you go back to the Jim Carrey liar, liar? And if what you're thinking in your head is, they're a stupid idiot, they're a stupid idiot, do you just say it because you're thinking it? Is that the way out of hypocrisy? Or is there a different solution? I'm going to pause there. We're going to come back to the passage in a moment, but I want to hear your reactions. What's the way out of that dilemma? You don't want to be a hypocrite, but you don't want to be rude. John.
I think intent is at the center of this.
Mm-hmm.
If my intent is to do damage on someone else, that's a problem. If my intent is to help that person, even though this could be a difficult conversation, then that's different. If my intent is to talk about you in a demeaning way behind your back, and my intent is to do damage on you, I feel as if I'm a hypocrite.
Yep.
So whatever I say, if my intent is to lift you up or lift somebody else up, even in favor of myself, that's acceptable. Of course, if my intent is to hurt you, that is not.
Yep. Nicely put. Thank you, John. Anybody else want to add to that? Yes, Ken. Oh, we're hand over here, please. Please, please.
You know, I'm listening to all that we're saying, and it's probably extremely obvious, but you become a hypocrite when you become judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not until you become judgmental, you're guilty of the same thing, of being false, or being phony, but being a hypocrite is being, in my mind, judgmental of someone when you're just the same way, or you have similar things. And so walking away from that, and again, your conversation was that diplomacy, as we talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
But the hypocrite piece is being judgmental of that person and harsh them when you walk away.
Thank you. I don't think I saw any other hand. I want to pull us back into the passage to illustrate what you just said. Drop down into the story for today. We'll go do a little bit more review of the story above, but drop down to the story of today. Look at verse 2 of chapter 12, way down at the bottom of the page. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs. Now, let me give you a modern day example of that. How many of you have heard stories of public speakers or pastors who have been off stage with their mics on?
Wow.
That happened to me once. It was before a wedding, Roseville, California. I still remember. And there were two pastors involved in that wedding. We both were mic'd up, and we were off stage. We were in actually the pastor's office, and he and I were talking about the couple that we were about to perform the ceremony for. The microphone was on, it was live for both of us. Fortunately, we were saying nice things. But what if we hadn't? What if we had been saying some really nasty things? And this was broadcast to the congregation for about, and I think it was only about 15, 20 seconds before a very alert, 15 seconds alert, PA guy flipped us off. He didn't flip us off. He turned the microphone off. And I am just grateful that we were saying nice things. But what if we had not been? Now, let me take that example and give you a real life experience of my own hypocrisy. Ken mentioned the job that I'm in right now. One of my jobs is to be the punching bag for the university. I get more angry calls than I've ever had in my life. People really, really angry about this or that or the other thing at the university. And sometimes the people are so angry and they're so irrational that I cannot believe that they are intelligent adults. And the things that they are screaming at me, that they're upset about, are just, and I realize that there's an appropriate place for me to come home and vent to my wife. And so again, I can't tell you that I know all of the ways to draw the lines here. And I will come home sometimes and Ryan will say, well, how was your day today? And I'll say, well, I had a few phone calls. And what struck me is that if my mic was on, Jesus says, there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner room will be proclaimed from the roofs. What if what I was saying to Lorraine was with a live mic with this person listening? What would be the impact? Would there be congruence between the way that I had attended to them on the phone and tried to be diplomatic and tried to be helpful, and what I was saying to her afterwards? Now, again, all of us in this room may answer that question slightly differently. I'll tell you what the most honest thing is that I have said to her in situations like this, and I'm not sure that it would be bad for them to know that I've said this. I've said this maybe only half a dozen times in the last 5 years. I've said, Lorraine, after work today, I just want to hit somebody in the face as hard as I can.
Yeah.
And she's laughed when she's heard that, because she said, you are not a violent man. I said, I know, it's why it scares me. But there is something about the way that I've experienced today. I just feel like I need to hit somebody. Now, I've not done that, fortunately. But that's a very honest feeling that I come away from sometimes a really tough day. And then I have to go out, and I was talking with Jana just before class started here, that my therapy this summer, you know that we have been at British Columbia, at our home in British Columbia, and I've been working remotely, been working online, but we do a lot of yard work, and we've got all the growth that has grown up that we couldn't get there during COVID. And so we have been limbing and cutting brush and hauling rocks and burning burn piles and spreading gravel. And it's hard physical work. And I'll tell you, 3 or 4 hours of that every afternoon has been wonderful therapy for me, almost as good as hitting somebody in the face. So here's my point. And that is when Jesus says, there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs. I think Jesus is saying at least two things. One of the things he's saying is, what if your mic was on? And everything that you said privately was heard by the people you were talking about. Would they find congruence? Would they find that what's inside and what's outside is the same thing? And that's a good question to ask ourselves. And if it's not the same, what do we need to do to make it the same? And I would suggest, now let's go back up to the story in chapter 11. Read again here what Jesus says. Verse 40, he says, you foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside too? You clean the outside of the cup, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. So is the solution to stop cleaning the outside of the cup? No. The solution is to clean the inside of the cup too. And so isn't the logical conclusion that when we find a difference between what's inside and what's outside, that we ask God to take care of what's inside? We don't stop taking care of the outside, but we ask him to take care of what's inside, so that what is inside matches what's outside. And here Jesus points out specifically greed and wickedness. And I'll have to admit that I have come home sometimes and I've been filled with greed and wickedness. And I have said things about other people that I would not have been happy for them to hear me saying about them. And so what do I ask God to do? I ask God to change what's inside of me, so that that's not the way that I am feeling about them, and that God changes my heart. I mentioned to you several weeks ago on our subject on prayer that one of my favorite promises is Ezekiel 36:26, where God says, a new heart will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh, and I will cause you to walk in my ways, and you will do them and keep them. And what does it mean to walk in God's ways? It means to love people like Jesus did. It means to have an internal attitude toward people like Jesus' attitude toward those people. And even if I may speak directly to them, I'm speaking the truth in love. I'm not going around behind their back calling them stupid idiots because I can. Instead, I'm asking God to change my heart so that I see people differently and I don't see them the way that greed and wickedness causes me to see them. Now, I'm not saying that this is the whole answer to the subject of hypocrisy and authenticity, but it's one that's very real for me, that I'm experiencing, that God is working within me. We're going to go back to the passage. We're almost out of time here. I want to see a couple other things in the passage, but before we do, I may have raised some comments or questions, and I'm going to give you a chance to comment, and then I'm going to come back to the rest of our story for today. Please, I see a hand back there.
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting about the word hypocrisy is it comes from a couple of, I guess, Latin words. One of them is hypo, which you recognize from hypodermic, different things. And the other is the criticism. And I just take this personally whenever I look at it. And I think, you know, if I don't live a truthful life, I am under criticism. And I don't have to go any further than myself. It's easy to go with what other people do, but I usually have to stop with myself.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree. Did I miss anybody else's hand? Anybody else have a hand up? Please, a couple here. Yeah.
Here.
Okay.
I'm thinking about this, and it seems like sometimes I have a charitable heart towards someone who's, you know, off base in some way. And sometimes I'll even talk to them. A lot of times I have a bad attitude about them. It's a struggle there. But the thing that I don't do, and I just thought about it, was that when I notice something in a person that is correctable or inappropriate or whatever, I might want to talk to them, or I might just think about it in a negative way, but I don't analyze it, see how much of that I do.
Yep. And Gordon, what you are reflecting here is what Jesus said about the sawdust in your own eye. I mean, the sawdust in somebody else's eye and the log in your own eye. And he says, take a look at that log in your own eye before you start looking at the sawdust in somebody else's. Thank you. Okay, we're going to take one comment here, and then I'm going to get back to the story. We got to wrap up here in a few minutes.
And Doug,
please.
Ken, comment. This Ken.
Please, Ken.
Kind of struck me as you were talking here a bit that the word diplomacy has been raised here today. When I look at Jesus' response to the Pharisees, it doesn't seem very diplomatic.
Exactly. Thank you, Ken. And diplomacy is not the highest virtue. Diplomacy is a virtue to be used at some times, but sometimes speaking the truth in love may not look very diplomatic. Good point. Thank you. We've got, I think, 2 more hands in the back, and I want to take those and then come back to the passage.
So, Doug, I remembered that Solomon said, for everything under the sun, there's a season.
Yep.
There's a time and a place to speak, just like Jesus spoke to them.
Yep.
What they need to remember is that sometimes nothing hurts like the truth.
Yep.
But in the long run, the truth will always hurt you less than anything withstanding.
Yep. John, thank you. And we're going to come to this other hand, but John, I was afraid for a minute you were going to tell me there's a time and a place for everything under the sun, and there's a time and a place for me to hit somebody in the face. So I'm glad you didn't go there.
We have
one more comment here.
We've got one more comment, Rocket.
So I don't know how many have heard of Kohlberg's theory of moral development, but many of us are at stages 3 and 4, which we follow the rules, and the 4s kind of tell everyone when they're breaking rules. But as we go to stages 5 and 6, and they say that there's a stage 7, which is where Jesus was, instead of being concerned with the rules, we're concerned with their soul.
Yep.
And just like Jesus, he didn't tell people they were wrong. He would tell them a parable.
Yep.
And then he would force them to think. And that's what, so when we see someone and we think they're breaking the rule or they're not dressed like they think they should be dressed, just think of where we are morally in our development, because we should be moving towards levels 5 and 6 and not be stuck at 3 and 4.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to come back to the passage. We've got about 7 minutes to wrap up class, but let's come back. Look at the highlights again of chapter 11 and look down at verse 42. He says, middle of verse 42, he says, you neglect justice and the love of God. And then verse 43, you love the uppermost seats. Verse 46, you load people down with burdens that they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. We could spend as much time on every one of those phrases as we did on the very first one, but they all come back to this idea of hypocrisy that is so tied to selfishness that says, I want to remain a greedy, selfish, critical, harsh person on the inside who disregards other people, but I don't want people to know it. I want to look good on the outside. And so I'm going to hold on to all the garbage on the inside, but try to make myself look good on the outside. As I understand the story of chapter 11, that's the essence of it. It's this difference between inside and outside, and it's the desire to hold on to that garbage inside, never get rid of it, and try to make people think that you're something different than you are. Jesus speaks this truth to the Pharisees, and then, going back to our story for today in verse 1, meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered, incidentally, just historically, we're about, we're getting close to the cross, and these are people probably gathering toward Jerusalem for the feast. And that's probably why there's so many, but they're also gathering toward Jesus. It's interesting. Jesus then moves out of the Pharisees' house. He goes out into the crowds. They're trampling on one another. But Jesus turns his attention not to the crowd in this moment. He will later, but he turns his attention to the 12. Presumably, they have been with him at this dinner party. And Jesus wants to make sure that they don't lose the impact of what he said, because it would be easy for them to think, those dirty old Pharisees, Jesus got them. They got what they deserved. And instead, Jesus says, we've had some pretty tough conversation there, but you're not exempt from this. This applies to you too. Don't just think this is about them. This is about all of us. And Jesus said, he began first to speak to his disciples saying, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Jesus did not walk out of there and say to the 12, well, you guys are really immune from all this stuff I just said to them. You don't need to worry about any of that because you don't have any of it. Instead, he says, this is human nature, and it may look different in your life, but you've got to be watch out for this too. And then he says what we read several times here about the rooftop. And then these comments, and I want to just close briefly with this. What we see in verses 4 through 12 is a combination of warnings and promises. And Jesus gives a warning, and then he gives a promise. He gives a warning, and he gives a promise. He gives a warning and a promise. And could I wrap it up with this? We don't have time to go through all those warnings and promises, but I want you to notice Jesus' care for the people that he's even giving warnings to. When he says, you need to watch out for this, he also says, and I want you to know how valuable you are. God cares for the little birds. You're more valuable than the little birds. He knows how many hairs are on your head. You think it's difficult to know how to speak? Don't worry. God will give you words in the most difficult times to know what to speak. You think it's hard to stand up for Jesus, to stand up for me in opposition? know that I'm going to stand up for you in front of others. Every warning is coupled with a promise. And here's where I'd like to wrap this up. That we could leave this class beaten up. We could leave this class feeling like, oh, I'm a hypocrite. I'm not treating people well. I feel like punching people in the face. We could leave here with shame and guilt and weighted down. And that's not where Jesus wants us to leave. He wants us to know we're precious. He wants us to know, even though we pay more attention to the outside of the cup than the inside of the cup, even though our heart may be filled with wickedness and greed, even though we treat other people badly, he says, I want you to know how precious you are to me. And my real goal is to help you become different than you are, to give you a new heart, to help you become what you want to be, so that what is inside is the same as what's outside. That's what he wants for us. And he gives us these warnings coupled with promises so that we won't walk away discouraged. So that instead we'll say, oh God, I'm so thankful that in spite of my own ignorance, my own stupidity, I am treasured and I'm valued by you. And you want to change me from the inside out to make me like Jesus. So that the care that I want to show for other people is not just an outside thing, it's deeply inside as well. That's the journey that I'm on. I believe it's the journey that most of you are on, maybe all of you are on. And I want today's passage to encourage us that we're moving in the right direction, that Jesus is doing a work in us that really is valuable, and to let him keep doing that work in you. Ken, let me turn it back over to you.
About your bad day, Doug. A friend of mine told me once that you're not having a bad day, you're having bad thoughts. Bad thoughts. No, really, I'm having a bad day. The reason that I left this church when I was a young man was stemmed from hypocrisy, hypocrites. As I began to work my way slowly back into this church, there was a great Adventist teacher, great man. I would have moments where that I would see this hypocrisy. And I would complain to him. These Adventists will never change. These Adventists are just as big as, you know. And one day I was ranting about it. And when I said, "You finished?" I said, "Yes." And he cleared his throat and he said, "I want you to know that Jesus went to church every Sabbath morning of his life."
Yeah.
Every Sabbath morning of his life. And considering what he had to put up with, I am sure that you will find a way to work through this. That really helped me. It really helped me. And I have found a way in most cases to work through this. It may take a while, but hypocrisy is a dangerous thing. And I'm glad my mic is not on live every segment of that. For those that are visitors, Doug writes our lessons each week. I email them out when I get them. If you'd like to be on our email list, please come up and give me your name and email address, and we'll get you on today. Next week, Duane will be teaching. I'm going to miss that. She does a great job. And by the way, Doug, you just knock it out of the park every time you get in front of us. It's just great. And with that said, we'll close. John, will you have a prayer, please?
Father, thank you for bringing us all together again. Thank you for filling this room, allowing us to share our honest thoughts with each other as we learn from each other, knowing it is actually from you. Father, thank you for the blessings and the graces that you give us. Help us understand that our reason is through you and dictated by you. Open our ears to listen. In your name, amen.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.